All right. First, to address the first part of the question, um, what is film noir? Film noir was a type of film that was really ushered in the 1940s. It was typically categorized. There are a lot of things that it needed to have in order to be film noir. It needed to have criminals. It needed to have a detective slash anti-hero. There was typically lots of cynicism involved, mistrust for women, moral ambiguity. It ushered in an era of low key lighting, which was simply light that came from only one source. So when you would watch a film noir, it was incredibly shadowy because when you only have one light source, it was casting all of these shadows, and it was popularized through American film, even though the term film noir itself is a French term that very literally just means black film. Um, it became huge. The Maltese Falcon is a great example of one of the films that ushered in this new era of film noir in American cinema. So some of the key stylistic and narrative traits of the genre that you see in The Lady from Shanghai, specifically, one, you do see that low key lighting, so shadowy, especially in the scene where they're hanging out in the crazy house. You see the very morally ambiguous anti-hero detective. You have the mistrust for women. The main character who's in this crazy triangle and leading this guy into the crazy house, and then you have that fast-paced dialogue right at the very end that's so full of darkness and cynicism and mistrust on both ends. The Lady from Shanghai is your very characteristic film noir. So to move on to the second part of the question, one other film movement or approach to cinema that we studied that is different than this, I would say. I think a fun one to contrast and compare film noir to is the surrealism movement because I thought that the first PowerPoint slide of this week's lecture was very interesting because if you looked at each of the examples, in all of them you saw like a guy with a top hat and like a pretty girl in like a dress and then the guy that looks like a detective. Like the interesting part of film noir is there are so many very specific characteristics that make it film noir that they did typically fall under a pretty specific narrative. You've got the anti-hero, you've got the girl, and you've got kind of the criminals, and there's a case that needs to be solved. And it really did follow a pretty clear path. It kind of played by the rules that were set up to be this is what it means to be film noir. Whereas with surrealism, there were no rules, there were no boundaries. That was the whole point of the movement. It was to kind of abolish the whole idea of a cohesive narrative in general. So I think it's interesting to see that compare, to see how contrasting those ideas were. One interesting way that they were similar was kind of this moral ambiguity. There was no real good guy, there was no real bad guy. Like at the end of The Lady from Shanghai, that clip that I watched, I wasn't sure who I was pulling for. I wasn't sure who was in the wrong, and there was a lot of ambiguity and surrealism as well. So that's one area where they were a little bit more similar. But yeah, film noir, it's something fun to watch. I think it was a nice change of pace from the things that had been studied before. It went a little bit more by the rules. It was more of a narrative, but really great films between Maltese Falcon, Citizen Kane, things of that nature. It was a really great period of film.